Does it make sense to buy a Mac Pro 6,1 in 2020? Apple's shiny new Mac Pro 7,1 is out, and it's also outside of the price range of many users. So what about an earlier generation Mac Pro instead? Now the Mac Pro 6,1, or trash can as it's often referred to, didn't get much love amongst the professional community when it was launched. That's primarily due to the perception that it's very non-upgradable. In fact, even on the used market, many people are preferring the older generation Mac Pro 5,1, the original cheesegrater, to this newer trash can Mac. So if you're looking for a Mac Pro and you don't have, or you don't want to spend the £5,500 point of entry price for the new Mac Pro, which of these two older Mac Pros should you go for? Should you go for the older generation, the 5,1 that's massively upgradable, or does this trash can Mac actually make sense? I've been having a look around on the UK eBay site, and what I found is that you can get a Mac Pro 5,1 in good condition for around about £500. Now that's going to get you a quad-core or a 6-core model. If you can stretch your budget to about £800, £850, then you get the dual CPU model, so you can have two of those 6-core CPUs, effectively giving you a 12-core Mac Pro for well under £1,000. What's not to like about that? Particularly when you consider that PCIe upgradability that's going to allow you to add fast NVMe storage and latest generation graphics cards. How far can you upgrade? Well, the fastest CPU that you can put in one of those Mac Pros is the Xeon X5690. Now, that's quite an old CPU by today's standards, but it still performs relatively well. In fact, if you compare it against the Core i5 that's in the iMac I've got, that's an i5 7600K, what you'll notice is that the X5690 is a little bit behind on multi-core performance. On single-threaded applications, it does fall quite a way behind. But don't forget, in that Mac Pro, you can have two of those processors. And that means for multi-threaded applications, you can still get great performance out of a Mac Pro 5,1. When it comes to RAM, if you've got the dual CPU tray, you can go all the way up to 128 gigabytes, which should be more than enough for most users. And of course, because it's old tech, that RAM is very cheaply available on eBay, so it's easy to upgrade. With your storage as well, you can actually install NVMe SSD storage in the Mac Pro, provided you buy a PCIe adapter card. Those aren't particularly cheap, but it's probably worth the investment because those SSD drives will absolutely fly if you've installed it correctly and installed the firmware update that comes with the Mojave installer. And of course, with those PCIe slots, you can install the latest graphics cards and make the most of GPU computational performance. Now for your data storage needs where you don't need lightning fast performance, of course there's plenty of SATA capacity within the Mac Pro. You've got four 3.5-inch drive sleds where you can install spinning drives, and you could also put a 2.5-inch SSD underneath the super drive if you've just got one super drive installed. So plenty of options there for expandability. The Mac Pro 5.1 came with USB 2 as standard, but you can easily upgrade to USB 3 with a PCIe add-in card. In fact, you can go up to USB 3.1 and even have USB-C ports on your Mac with the right type of card. If you're interested in that, check out my channel. I've made a video on installing the Sonnet USB-C add-on card. So the Mac Pro 5.1 sounds like a great option. It's fairly cheap to buy, it's very upgradable. What's the catch? Well, a few things to be aware of. First of all, there's no Thunderbolt support, and it will be impossible to add Thunderbolt support to this computer. And that may or may not bother you, but I know for some people that would be a deal breaker. Also remember that the PCI Express is generation 2, so your latest generation graphics cards may not achieve optimum performance. And perhaps most significantly, Apple has dropped support for the Mac Pro 5.1 from the latest operating system, Catalina. So whilst it is possible to install Catalina, you've got to employ various hacks to do it, and it's not officially supported by Apple. And again, that may be something that concerns you. I guess the final thing to bear in mind is the cost of the upgrades. Now, whilst you can probably get the CPU and RAM fairly cheaply, your latest generation graphics card is always going to cost a lot of money, and the adapters for the NVMe SSD storage can be very expensive. So bear all of that in mind because it could all add up to being a very expensive and very nearly obsolete computer. Now, I did have a Mac Pro 5.1, as you'll see if you look at other videos in my channel. What I found was it started to feel a little bit dated, and so I made the decision to sell mine and I bought an iMac instead. But just recently I had the opportunity to acquire this Mac Pro 6.1, and I thought it'd be interesting to get it and have it as a bit of a project and just sort of investigate whether this is a good computer to invest money in 2020. Now, I think that this is a beautiful piece of design. I know not everybody's going to agree with me on that, but it looks beautiful, it's beautifully made. And I really like the principle of it. Basically, all of the components are attached to a central heat sink, and then you've got the fan at the top, which draws in air from the bottom and it sort of vents out of the top of the case. I think it's quite an ingenious design. I love the way that you can just take it apart. There we go, that is metal, that the top part. And you know, what a beautifully made thing that is. Now, true, the lack of PCIe slots is a bit of a pain, and it does make upgrading quite difficult. And I can understand why a lot of pro users would not want this machine for that very reason. Now, technically, it is possible to add a PCIe enclosure and connect it via Thunderbolt. And that might be a solution for you, but it's obviously not the most aesthetically pleasing solution. You know, this is a beautifully designed computer. You probably don't want this sat on your desk with an ugly PCIe expansion box sat next to it. The other slight issue with this particular computer is the way that Apple designed the GPUs. Each one of these Mac Pro trash cans has 2 GPUs inside. One of them controls all of the display outputs, and the other one is used purely for computational tasks in applications like Final Cut Pro. But not every application makes use of the second GPU, so most of the time it is sat idle. Apple obviously expected that GPU computing was going to be a big thing, and they kind of designed themselves into a corner. In fact, that's exactly what they admitted when they announced the new Mac Pro. Now, technically, you can swap out the GPUs on a Mac Pro trash can. But the problem is that the GPUs are proprietary, as in they're mounted on proprietary cards. So the only GPU that you're ever going to be able to put in there is one of the GPUs that was originally designed for it. And there are 3, the D300, the D500 and the D700. So if you've got, like I've got here, an entry-level Mac Pro with the D300s in, if I could find 2 D700s, then theoretically I could upgrade my machine. But these parts are not easily available, and when they are available, they are not cheap. So there's just simply no point in doing that. So another option for upgrading the graphics performance on a Mac Pro trash can is to use an eGPU, so an external GPU enclosure that connects via Thunderbolt. Now, most of these eGPU enclosures connect via Thunderbolt 3, and the trash can doesn't have Thunderbolt 3, but you can use a Thunderbolt 3 to Thunderbolt 2 adapter. I've seen examples of this working. There is also a script that you need to run to enable support within the OS. That's a third-party script. Apple doesn't officially support the use of eGPU with the trash can. And I suppose it's possible that they could remove that support or stop that script from working in future releases. Now, from what I've seen, there's a negligible speed difference between Thunderbolt 3 and Thunderbolt 2 when it comes to an eGPU that has a display plugged into it. So it is a very real possibility of an upgrade for this particular computer. And I suppose the benefit with an eGPU is that, you know, it's portable. You can use it with any of your Macs. You know, if you've also got a laptop, you can use it to accelerate your laptop as well. So the investment is not totally dead money. When it comes to RAM on the trash can, the maximum it supports is 128 gigabytes. It's very easy to upgrade. There's 2 slots on either side. You just lift the cover off as I did just now and slot the new RAM in. So that's nice and easy. But what about the CPU? It is in fact upgradable. OWC on their YouTube channel have a guide on how to tear down the Mac Pro and install a new CPU, but it's probably not for the faint-hearted. We bought this particular Mac Pro new in 2015 for our web studio. The company purchased it. And it's the entry-level model. We paid 2.5 grand for it. And it's a quad-core Xeon, 12 gigs of RAM, 256 gig SSD, and 2 D300 GPUs. And not long after we bought this, Apple whacked the prices up on these entry-level models all the way to £3,000 for some reason. Now, we've used it in the studio day in, day out for the last 4 years or so, and we finally decided to dispose of it, and so I acquired it personally. I bought it off the company because I thought it would be an interesting project. And I've done some basic benchmarks with this computer in Geekbench 5, and as you can see, it's fairly unimpressive. It scores 803 for single core and 3,229 for multi-core. Now let's just compare this to my 27-inch iMac, which is the 2017 model. It's got a Core i5 7600K. And if you look at those results, you'll see that the Mac Pro seems fairly average, frankly. And when you compare it to a top iMac, the one with the Core i9 9900K CPU, you can see that it's very far behind indeed. But let's not forget that that top iMac costs well over £3,000. And you can get an entry-level Mac Pro on eBay for around about £1,000. So what can you do with your Mac Pro 6.1? What am I going to do with my Mac Pro? Well, I'm going to upgrade it. I found some RAM, 64 gigabytes, and I've paid £65 for that off of eBay. So once that comes, I'm going to install that, and then I'll run the Geekbench 5 test again, because as I understand it, an increase in RAM will mean a better Geekbench 5 score. So we'll see what difference that actually makes. Next, I've decided to upgrade the CPU, and I've got to confess I'm quite nervous about doing this, but I'm going to give it a go. I've built a lot of computers over the years. I should be able to do it, and if I can do it, I'm sure anybody out there can do it. But which CPU should I go for? Basically, it seems to me it boils down to a couple of choices. Now, the very best CPU you can put in here is the Xeon E5 2697 version 2. That's the 12-core CPU. But it seems to me that the sweet spot is actually probably the 8-core. You see, the more cores you have, the lower the clock speed, and therefore the worse your single-threaded performance becomes. So 12-core gives you amazing multi-threaded performance, but poorer single-threaded performance. And at the other end of the spectrum, you've got the quad-core, which gives you great single-core performance, but poor multi-threaded performance. So it's about finding a balance between the two. I thought the 8-core might be the sweet spot, and there's a couple of routes to go down. Is the E5 1650 version 2, which is the CPU that Apple would have supplied with these new, but you can also use the E5 2667 version 2. There's not much difference between the two CPUs in terms of performance, but I've been thinking about this, and I looked at the prices on eBay, and what I found is there's not a lot of price difference between a 12-core and an 8-core, and in fact sometimes the 8-cores seem to cost more than the 12-cores. So I took the decision to buy the 12-core. At the end of the day, it's a Mac Pro. It's all about multi-threaded applications. It's about pro applications. I'm going to put the 12-core in. There's another reason as well, and that is, whilst the CPUs may cost no different buying them on the second-hand market, if I come to sell this Mac Pro used as a 12-core, it's worth a lot more than an 8-core. Now, I got my E5 2697 version 2 for £195, including shipping on eBay. It was pulled from a server that's been running in a data center all its life, so I've got no concerns about the quality of the processor. I'm looking forward to that arriving. And in part 2, what I'm going to do is disassemble the Mac Pro, install the new CPU, and put this thing back together. And then we'll do some basic benchmarks to see how much we've improved the performance. In part 3, I'm going to do some more comprehensive benchmarking, because what I want to do is see how this Mac Pro compares to other Macs on a variety of things. Graphics performance, which I suspect it'll fall far behind on, CPU, RAM storage speeds, those kind of things, to see, where does this fit in the whole lineup of Mac computers, and what's the value proposition for buying one of these things. In part 4, I want to have a look at some real-world tests. Now, benchmarks are great, but they only tell you part of the story, and I want to put this thing through its paces. I want to see how it performs on tasks that you would expect a Mac Pro to do. Someone who's buying a Mac Pro is going to want to be interested in, photo editing, video editing, perhaps even some audio work. So we'll do some of those things, and we'll just see how it compares. Is it still fast enough in 2020 to be considered as a viable option for a Pro user? If you want to see how I get on, please subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon there so that you'll be notified when I release the future episodes. And if you enjoyed this episode, please hit the thumbs up button. And I'll see you next time for some more geekery.